Send it to me so I can see the
Yes. Welcome, everyone, to the February 8th City Council work session. Welcome to this full room of people and the people at home as well. We have a couple items today, and the first one is a resolution that Councilor Zelenka is going to put forward for consideration. Are you ready to go on that? Mm-hmm. All right, you're up.
Okay. My intention in putting this was not to focus solely on corporations, but also on unions and special interests and big money in elections and politics. And I asked Glenn Klein to, when we were talking about drafting this, I wasn't clear about that, so I asked him to modify, and that's what's in front of you. Is in section H, it adds the words "and unions," and section in the be it resolved section 2.
In attachment A, or the one that was passed out?
The one that was passed out.
Okay,
Here,
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to
So,
clarify.
and I'm open to having that also say unions and special interests. That might even be better. My preference isn't to take action on this today. My preference is to have a discussion with it and save time for the other agenda items, but to have a discussion on this and bring it back for a vote on the Wednesday after next on the 15th. I won't be here on the Monday the 13th meeting, so I'd appreciate not taking action on it today, but having a conversation and then taking action on it and sit on it and think about it. I think it's one of these things that we should think about and deliberate about. To me, this is important. Several cities have already acted on similar. Madison, Boulder, other cities have taken similar action. To me, this is kind of fundamental and basic. Money is not speech, and therefore regulating political contributions and spending is not equivalent to limiting political speech. That's not how the Supreme Court held in Citizens United. And what Citizens United case 2 years ago does is, I think, create an unequal playing field between us human beings, people, natural persons, and corporations and special interests and unions, and with respect to campaign financing and negating nearly a century of precedents and law that's been put forth. So this unregulated, unlimited, anonymous contributions, I don't think is good for our country, and it's not good for our democracy. And we've seen the rise of these super PACs that have no accountability and may outspend the candidates by a long shot. So this rise of big money in politics and elections, I think, is corroding our democracy, as do many other people. And so I think elections are becoming a venue for the very wealthy, and they're crowding out the voice of the people. And I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be. This resolution calls for a constitutional amendment to reverse the impacts of Citizens United decision, and it supports the efforts by Senator Merkley and Congressman DeFazio in their resolutions, Senate Joint Resolution 29 and House Joint Resolution 72, which we can get copies of. They're only 2 pages long. They both essentially say the same thing, and both of our representatives are putting forth resolutions that essentially ask for a constitutional amendment and the authority to regulate campaign contributions and spending.
Are you taking a cue?
So we actually have a long history at the council of taking up issues of national importance. And indeed, most of the change that actually occurs, a lot of it comes from grassroots effort and from cities urging Congress and the President to act. And this would be in that long tradition. So I urge you to support this resolution. And again, if we could hold off action on it and talk about it, but then bring it back on the 15th, that would be my preference.
Thank you. And actually, what that would do is, even though you can't be there, we have a council meeting on Monday, so it would give a public forum time for us to hear from the public, which seems important in this.
I actually had that in my notes, but I didn't say it.
So I appreciate that, because I think that's important. And this is not time sensitive, so we have time to do it. Pat, you're up, and then George. And then George.
Just a point of process. I prefer to have, if the agenda is going to be changed, we have an agenda item for action today. And if it's going to be changed, I'd like to hear about it before the start of the meeting. So it's a little bit frustrating when items get changed like that. That being said, as a council, we're elected to make decisions for the city of Eugene. And anytime that we divert our attention to a different stage from the one that's directly in front of us from the decisions that we are chartered to do, it becomes confusing for our constituents, I believe. And so when it comes forward, I'll have more to say about that.
George?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I have no problem delaying a vote on this till next week. I think that's fine. I think it'd be good to have an intervening public forum so people could, express their views. I pretty much agree with everything Councilor Zelenka just said. It's obvious that corporations are not human beings. Their influence is, unfortunately, really corrupted our democracy, I believe. Among many other corrupting influences, that's a major one. And I see the amended resolution here, and I notice that unions have been added. And to me, I was wondering about do we have any examples of other cities' resolutions, first of all, come to hand where unions mentioned in their resolutions? Because this implies that unions and the money that they donate is of a scale commensurate with what corporations, and there's absolutely no comparison at all. I mean, unions are becoming weakened every year instead of strengthened. So I'm just wondering why they would be put on in the resolution equal footing with corporations, because corporations outspend the unions. I don't know by what magnitude, but it's fairly astronomical. So that would be my question. I mean, how does this differ from other cities' resolutions? And if there's a significant difference, and I'm kind of curious about the mention of unions in there.
Okay. George Bowling?
Well, Monday morning, early, about 7 o'clock Monday morning, I sent an email to everybody to get some clarification, and one of them was that I wanted wording in the resolution to include unions and other special interest groups, and if that couldn't be included, then a definition of corporations to include that. And the reason why is my understanding the original court ruling on Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission specifically addressed corporations, unions, and other special interest groups. So to me, this is a very important one word that needs to be added into this resolution if we're going to pass it. I agree that money is starting to take over campaigns, and I think not only should we be having this discussion on a federal level, but I think we should make it a local discussion. When you have $100,000 spent on a local election by a candidate for a 4-year term, that's ridiculous. To spend $100,000 on a local election. So, I'm glad that Glenn, that you've added the wording into this on the amended resolution, and I'm still really perplexed by the unlimited independent campaign expenditures wording. My understanding is, and Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong on this from what the information you supplied, was that term will be determined by each individual state. Now, how unfair is that? If it's going to be in a resolution, it needs to be hopefully they'll address that on the national level and make it the same everywhere. Otherwise, it's going to be unfair from one state to the next. So there's still a lot of loopholes and gaps that need to be fixed in this resolution before I can get 100% behind it. But in theory, I am behind it. That, like Alan said, that money is starting to buy elections, even on the local level.
Mayor, if I can just clarify, in terms of what the limits would be, Congress would be the one to set the limits for federal elections. So for federal elections, it would be uniform across the country. Each state would have the ability under the proposed amendments that Alan referenced. Each state could determine whether to have, and if so, what the limits would be for that particular state for a state election.
I see. Okay. Anyway, I still think that we should maybe have the same discussion as far as local elections, too, to set a spending limit. Right now, we have a voluntary spending limit, And if one candidate says, yeah, I voluntarily agree not to spend X amount, his opponent can say, oh, sorry, and spend as much as they want. So I think we should, if we're going to try to level the playing field in elections, it should be not only federally, but also locally.
Chris?
Thanks. I appreciate a lot of what George is saying, and I would agree with a lot of it. And I would really like for the language of our resolution to mirror what was in the actual Supreme Court decision. So if corporations, unions, and special interests are the language of the original court decision, it would be great if our language could parallel that to the greatest degree possible. So I would agree with that. In principle, I also agree. It was in my opinion, the Citizens United decision was not a good one. Mm-hmm. It was not where we need to go, particularly in terms of money. And for all the arguments we've heard over and over and over again, I don't need to go back into that. So I will deal on one thing specifically, and it comes from my perspective that when you want to make an argument, you want to make the most solid argument you can, and you don't want to kind of go off into unusual territory as part of your overall argument. And so I'm specifically drawing attention to item number L, which is on the second page, which to me is, of the other ones there, which are fine, I think this one is a little shaky in that it gets to the question of intent. Mm-hmm. And I think whenever you start basing an argument on intent and you don't have proof of the intent, you're starting to make your argument shaky. This runs on the intent expectation that corporations put shareholders ahead of concerns for the greater good of society. Even by sticking the word often in there, you're still indicating that corporations intend to do this for the most part. The other part is that individual stakeholders, as natural persons, balance, that we have no proof that individuals balance their decision. I don't want to nitpick, but what I'm saying is I have concerns that item L is not a solid argument. And so I would be willing to listen to the fact this resolution going forward is fine. I'm just not comfortable with having L in there because to me it weakens the argument by starting to throw a lot of stuff in here that doesn't really have a basis in fact.
Betty?
I think L argues for, I don't know whether it belongs in here or not, but I think that it argues for not including unions. Unions are very different from corporations. And Glenn didn't answer yet the question before whether, I don't think the Portland resolution included unions, did it?
I don't know what the other city resolutions contain. We can check on that.
I sent you the one from Portland some time ago.
Yeah, I don't recall. The reason why unions is here is the Citizens United case mentioned both corporations and unions. The statute that the Supreme Court struck down was one that limited corporations and unions. So if what you're trying to do is, in essence, reverse the Citizens United decision, you would need to say corporations and unions. Special interest wasn't part of it. And I'll check, Betty, on Portland. I don't recall what Portland said.
I don't believe it was.
I don't think it was. I think a union is very different. It represents the interests of working people, whereas corporations, as it says in L here, represent the interests of profit, people who want to make a profit, which is very different. But I think we've had this argument before about whether it's a local matter or not, and I think it definitely is a local matter for people in local governments to express the interests of their population to federal entities. When we had the Patriot Act resolution, we discussed that, and we did pass it. That's some years ago now, but opposing two parts of the Patriot Act, at least. And this comes up every time we talk about a resolution. People say pay attention to our own business, but I think part of our own business is to affect the federal government, which affects all of us. Thank you.
I just add before I go to the second round, Andrea, okay, that in fact, I guess people who are facing foreclosures here at home would think that some of the federal decisions have something to do with what happens in our own communities. So just a connection is very clear for people these days. Andrea.
Thank you, Mayor. So I don't really have a strong opinion about as I read this, as I read this, I mean, it makes sense that, corporations are not people, and they should not have the same weight as, individuals, supporting somebody for office. They do have bigger checkbooks, and so this kind of makes sense to me. I guess I want to speak to the issue around resolutions that aren't city-oriented. I think one that I was pretty passionate about was the DREAM Act. And I think we respond to requests from community around these things, and it's our job to do our homework on whether or not we support these and how we want it framed. So with that, I am supportive of this, but I think, Alan, you could have let us know this morning. You could have sent us an email and let us know you were going to withdraw. That would have made it a little bit more, I mean, I just think it's respectful to let people know what you're doing and what your plans are.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, second round. Alan.
My apologies for not letting you all know. I thought you'd want more time to deal with this, and didn't expect that would be a problem. The reason it says "and unions" is because that is what is in the Citizens United case. And like Glenn said, I'm not an expert on Citizens United, but it doesn't say special interest. But I'm okay with adding special interest into that as well, because the intent. I think Glenn was being very literal when I was talking about the drafting of this, and it can be more of the sense of the council than just specifically related to that Citizens United case. My intent was about the big money in politics and elections, and not necessarily the magnitude, George, of whether or not unions equal corporations or not, or special interests equal corporations. It's all of that combined that is problematic for me, and so that was my intent. And expanding that language makes a lot of sense to me. In the unlimited independent campaign expenditures language, is that in Citizens United, or is that a phrase that was kind of used to describe Citizens United?
I don't know. Basically, what Citizens United said is Congress can't impose limits. And so if there aren't any limits, then it's unlimited. So it might, I don't know whether that exact phrase was used. That's just the essence of the holding.
And if you read, and we'll get you the two Senate and House joint resolutions, they're very short too. They're 2 pages. They don't go into the detail about that, but they, because you need to first get over the hurdle of the constitutional amendment to be able to do the regulatory issues, and then you can figure out what the details are. And as far as local restrictions, I agree with you, George, but I'm not sure the city can actually do that. I think the state would end up preempting us because those laws are set by the state, not the city. And we do have the local rule, but it's just that. It's not a law. And as far as L is concerned, item L, it's my understanding that it is the law of the land by Supreme Court decision that, and maybe Glenn can figure out which one it is, I can't remember, or I don't know, is that the Supreme Court required in a legal opinion that corporations put profit ahead of any other consideration, so that the primary concern of a corporation is to make profit. Anything other than that is not the concern of a corporation. So that's the intent behind that, what's there in L. And maybe it could be
Yeah, I mean, it's better more about it, yeah.
But that's why that's in there.
Okay.
It's Dodge versus Ford Motor Company in 1919.
All right, Pat, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We have some people sitting in this room who've been doing a lot of work for the next agenda item. So far, we spent 20 minutes on this one, and I count at least a dozen paid staff members in the room here listening to us discuss this, when we have people in the audience who've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to make a presentation possible that's going to happen after this. We're taking time away from a charge that we have, that we are the only body charged to make the decisions on. That's Envision Eugene, and that's the future of this community. And we're taking time to look at federal actions that we don't have any particular charge over. It's kind of frustrating to me, because we need to talk about Envision Eugene. We don't need to sit here talking for this length of time, and now we're going to pass it along to another meeting. I'm sorry, I really encourage people who have taken the time to gather signatures on this to contact their federal representative. But for it to be taking time at the Eugene City Council, it's a waste of time, and I apologize to the people who put so much time into the presentation that we're going to be hearing after this today.
So the folks who asked us to deal with this, we, the people folks of Eugene, brought up three issues around this, Alan and everybody else. One is that they noticed that you removed a part that says that could be referred to the public for an advisory vote. And they noticed that you changed that it could be directed to send to the state legislature. And there was also the language in Part 2 of their original language that says, therefore, regulating corporate political contributions and spending is not equivalent to limiting public political speech, and they're concerned about that being removed. So there's three things, and I'm sure they'll be glad to talk to you about it and testify on at our forum, but I just wanted you to know those were the three issues that they've expressed concern about.
And Mayor, if I can clarify what happened, I got a request to prepare a resolution based on what had been submitted to basically accomplish the reversal of the Citizens United and support the proposed constitutional amendments. It was my decision, as I was trying to draft this and turn it into something for the council, to remove those things. It wasn't Alan or anybody else. An advisory vote, I can tell you right now what the state's going to say about that and what the cost would be. If the council wants to direct that, you could add that back in. But the direction I got was not to simply put City of Eugene where City of Portland or something else was. It was to try to reverse the Citizens United. And so I changed this to try to accomplish what I heard was the request from the council.
Thanks, Glenn. Just wanted to let everybody know. Yes, Alan. I'm sorry, did you read in the queue, George?
Yeah.
And then I'll call you.
I just wanted to respond to something Councilor Farr said. I mean, I think this is a very important discussion, and it is on our agenda, and I'm not saying Envision Eugene is not an important discussion. Obviously, it's very important. That's why we meet 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 times a month to discuss it, and I think we're going to have plenty of time to go over the material for Envision Eugene. This discussion that we're having right now is not a waste of time. A lot of people spend a lot of hours on this also, so I think it's totally appropriate for us to have this discussion. I think it's very important. Thank you.
Alan?
So the referral part, I think that's nice, but it's expensive, and I didn't actually, I agreed with Glenn that shouldn't be in here. When it has been up for a vote, in Madison, Wisconsin, in April 2011, it was approved by 84% of the voters, in Boulder, Colorado, 74%, and Dane County in Wisconsin, 78% of the voters approved it. I think in a recent poll, 80% of people disagreed with the Citizens United. That was an ABC poll decision by the Supreme Court. So I think there is public support for this. And as far as referring this to the state legislature, I'm okay with that, but they're not the ones that will take this up. It's a federal issue, and then I'm also okay with the money does not equal political speech part, and we can look at adding that back in, which is kind of why I wanted to do a work session, not an action on it. I was a little surprised when it came up as an action, but I think it's probably good practice for us to talk about it and then take action in the future on these kind of things.
Thank you for that. Okay, I don't see anybody else in the queue, so I think we'll let you think about this, and it'll come back at a future date. Thank you. All right, so we're going to go on to our next item on the agenda. That's Envision Eugene. City manager, assistant city manager in this case, because our city manager is out of town. And I might add that Councilor Clark called in and said he was not able to be with us today, too.
While they're kind of getting settled, I was just going to give you all a quick reminder, our workshop on Friday, there's a portion of that where we may do a tour of a couple of the downtown projects. So it'd be just good pre-planning on your part if you are dressed appropriately to walk from here to kind of LCC and back, and have shoes that are appropriate to walk into a construction site. So closed-toe shoes.
You want us to bring our hard hats?
Short walk. No, we'll take care of that. So it's not 100%. I just want you
Bring your hard head.
And umbrellas.
Hard head or hard
Yeah.
Right.
Well, as long as you don't have a hard heart, that's all right.
Well, on we go. Go ahead.
Slide one.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. We are here again to talk to you about Envision Eugene. Today we're specifically talking about our commercial land need and our multifamily land need and what our future projections around redevelopment and how that can help meet our land need. As you know, we've been working with a technical resource group who has been invaluable to help us work through these very complex issues. We have a subcommittee of that technical resource group, and that subcommittee is comprised of Mia Nelson, Kevin Matthews, Rick Duncan, and Sue Pritchard. And we're lucky enough to have Rick and Sue joining us at the table today to add some of their expertise and perspective to this discussion. And so before we get to that, though, I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who has a PowerPoint for us, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, thank you, Mayor and Council.
Mayor?
My name is Robin Hostig, planner with the City of Eugene Planning Division. So this is a continuation of a conversation that we had back in November around our multifamily housing demand and also commercial employment. So today what we're going to do is update you on some of these topics and also move on to share what we've learned about redevelopment and so just to kick it off, we're going to touch base with a quick reminder that the Community Resource Group early on broadly agreed to this concept of meeting all of our 20-year multifamily housing needs, excuse me, and commercial needs within the existing urban growth boundary.
Could you speak up, please? Thank you.
Sure. That doesn't amplify.
Okay.
You just have to speak up yourself because the microphone doesn't make it any louder there.
All right, I'll project.
But thank you.
So since the discussion with the Community Resource Group, we've been working to understand what it means to achieve this goal. So ultimately, we know that we need to demonstrate to the community and to the state that we're going to be able to do that and improve up on that. So today, we're going to share a little bit about what we've learned and about what that might take. So again, we're talking about our commercial and multifamily need, and we'll go ahead and start out with our multifamily need. And when we say multifamily housing, we're really talking about a whole variety of different housing types. Condos, apartments, row houses, anything that's attached, where the units are attached together. And we'll start out and go ahead and walk you through a really similar diagram to what we looked at last time. We're going to show you some updated numbers. I go through it bit by bit. The first thing I want to call your attention to in this diagram is similar to what we looked at last time, is that we're still looking at a range of housing mixes. So the top bar up there, the multifamily housing need, is the total need that we're looking for at, in this case, assuming for the moment, a 55-45 housing mix. And again, we're still looking at a range there. So moving on from our total need, we have a certain amount of existing capacity inside the urban growth boundary. That's there in the green bar. And that capacity is made up of several different items here on the lower row. So first of all, we have capacity in our vacant lands. These are lands that have no development on them whatsoever. We also have capacity on partially vacant lands, and we walked through a little more detailed study last time we talked about how we looked all over the community to identify partially vacant lands. Not finally, but the next piece here, redesignation, actually ends up potentially reducing our capacity somewhat for multifamily need, depending on how much multifamily land is redesignated for single-family use. So next up is baseline redevelopment. So this is capacity through, when we say baseline redevelopment, that's the natural rate of redevelopment that we would see if we don't take any further action. And this number is updated since we talked last time, in part because we've studied redevelopment since that time, and we'll talk to you a little bit more about that in just a couple of minutes. So after adding up all the capacity inside the urban growth boundary, everything that we think can happen, the remaining need is what we would need to look at when we consider this goal of meeting that need inside the urban growth boundary over the next 20 years. And the way that that would happen potentially is through additional redevelopment with interventions. So we'll talk about interventions towards the end of the presentation, since those affect both multifamily and commercial. So again, we're talking about multifamily and commercial. And we'll just kind of switch gears here a little bit and talk about our commercial need. And before we look at the number, well, actually, just backing up, our commercial employment need, these are jobs that are office jobs, retail jobs, any kind of service job, basically anything that's not an industrial type of a job. That's what we call commercial employment. So that's what we're talking about here. And before we look at the numbers, Council talked about 3 weeks ago, I believe, about employment growth rates. So the employment growth rate has a very significant effect on what our commercial employment need is going to be. And you may recall we looked at a previous employment forecast rate of 0.9% and then a more recent forecast rate of 1.8%. Well, communities also have the option of selecting some kind of a different rate in between and being, if they're able to justify that. So as we look at these numbers, we're just going to assume for the moment, for the sake of discussion today, a growth rate of 1.3%, which is about halfway between low and high rate. So looking at that 1.3% growth rate, that's what our commercial employment need would be. Again, this is a really similar diagram. There's just a couple of little changes that I'll point out to you. So that's our need. Again, we have existing capacity for commercial jobs inside the urban growth boundary already. Fairly significant capacity, comprised of, first of all, starting in the lower left-hand corner with jobs on existing land. And jobs on existing land, again, is basically filling up currently vacant office space or currently vacant retail space, and also home-based businesses. So the projection is that there will be more home-based businesses happening in the future as well. So neither one of those require new land. We also have vacant land and capacity there. And partially vacant land, we did a study for all the commercial lands around town, similar to what we did for multifamily housing, to identify some partially vacant land in commercial. And then we have our baseline redevelopment number for jobs. And I'll go through the work that we did in just a moment. This is a result of that. Again, baseline redevelopment is redevelopment with natural rate of redevelopment without any additional actions by the city. And I also want to point out that this number here for baseline redevelopment, that's almost entirely, well, it is entirely made up of medical office redevelopment, which is a special use that we'll get to in a second. So without medical office, we would probably see little, if any, redevelopment for additional commercial jobs over the next 20 years. So, subtracting the capacity from the need, we have a remaining need. It's fairly significant. And again, this is the target that we would need to be shooting for and thinking about when we consider meeting these jobs over the next 20 years inside the current UGB. And again, in this case, we'd have to show how we can meet that demand by boosting redevelopment through probably fairly substantial interventions. So I want to take a moment here as we talk about the work that we did for our baseline redevelopment. Actually, I'm just going to back up for a second. So since our last discussion, the Technical Resource Group, actually a subcommittee of the Technical Resource Group, has really delved in to better understand and quantify what redevelopment is going to look like over the next 20 years for commercial jobs. Now remember, for multifamily housing, we actually have historical data where we can look back and make some assumptions about what might happen in the future. We don't have good data for commercial redevelopment. So the Technical Resource Subgroup was in favor of taking a market-based approach to estimating future redevelopment. And what that means in a nutshell is basically using formulas like a developer might use to try to estimate the economics of a particular project, and then applying that citywide across all commercial lands to see what pencils out. So I want to take a moment and just recognize the great collaboration that has happened to make this work possible. And especially Sue and Rick have put in a huge amount of personal and professional time to make this happen. We just couldn't have done it without their expertise, so I just want to say thank you.
And I want to note that Kevin Matthews, who's part of your technical group, is in the room as well. Huh?
Yes, yes. So here's what we did. we built a sophisticated estimating tool. This is a very unique approach. No other community in the state has done anything quite like this. And it really brought to light some of the key variables and helped everyone understand the challenges involved with redevelopment. So it was a very in-depth type of work. And how it worked is we ran what we call prototype development scenarios for all the commercial properties. This is just an example of how we looked at very small, low-density projects all the way up to large, high-density type of projects. In this example here, these are just, it's kind of a visual of the 7 different office types we looked at. We did the same for retail, for multifamily housing, as well as mixed use. We then considered how viable these would be through a pro forma type of a formula across all the different commercial properties. And this is just a sampling here. There's a lot of detail, of course. This is just a sampling of dozens of different tables and all the numbers that we've been sorting through to try to understand this. And what that's helped do is really increase the transparency and understanding of how that works. So here's the bottom line. For multifamily housing, we're wrapping up discussions on this, but I think we're getting closer, somewhere between 205, 820 units, something along those lines. And again, this is on commercial property. And the other number here for commercial employment, that may seem like a surprisingly low number. So why is that?
Negative.
Yeah, well, that's potential too. So remember, we're talking about redevelopment here. So if there's a site that already has some kind of a building on it where people are employed, if you redevelop it, that means you're taking one set of jobs away, replacing them with another set of jobs. As an example, you might have a small strip mall that's replaced by like a retail store of some kind, maybe a larger store. So now, and historically, really, most the development types that are viable in Eugene's market are pretty low density. So you're replacing, in a lot of cases, one further low density use with another one when you talk about redevelopment under current conditions. Another point to make is that a lot of businesses currently are viable. They're making money for the owners and the people that own the property. So if it doesn't make economic sense, there's really no incentive for people to redevelop in the first place. There is, however, one type that's very different from the other ones, and this is medical office. Medical office has a tremendous amount of income-generating potential, and for that reason, it commands different things that can happen with this use. So it's also an employment cluster that's identified in the regional economic and economic prosperity plan, and the state forecast for jobs that we talked about just a minute ago includes medical office as a fairly significant chunk of our expected office need for the next 20 years. So because of these reasons, the subgroup decided to run a special case analysis for medical office. And we found that it's highly viable, even in today's market, for redevelopment. The 2 images we're seeing here, the Slocum Center and the 10 Coburg, are good examples of how that's happened. These are both on Lower Coburg Road. So we felt confident that it could occur through redevelopment. And at a 1.3% growth rate, this is about the number of jobs that we would see potentially for redevelopment for that use. So we add that up here, the bottom line. Again, we've got redevelopment potential, again, baseline redevelopment potential for multifamily housing, and over here for jobs. So we wanted to share just a couple of learning points that really came to light for us in doing this work. First of all, the relationship between rent and lease rates and construction cost is very important when you start talking about redevelopment. And the reality in Eugene is that rent and lease rates have been very flat for quite some time. My colleagues on the subgroup here can speak more to that than I can. In essence, those have been fairly flat. Construction cost has gone up significantly over that same amount of time, which makes it increasingly difficult from a market standpoint to do redevelopment in Eugene. And that's currently what the conditions look like. We've also learned that certain areas of town are closer to what we'd call the tipping point for redevelopment than others, and that may make intuitive sense. That also gets borne out of the numbers that we looked at. And those areas, just briefly, are downtown, the Franklin Boulevard and 13th Street area. Again, we're just talking about commercial property. South Willamette and also Lower Covert Road. So up to this point, we've been talking about baseline redevelopment, again, a natural rate without additional actions. So we're going to shift our attention here to talking about interventions. So these are actions that we might take to boost redevelopment above that baseline level. So last time we had a conversation with council back in November. We asked staff to go and do some research about what other communities have done to try to boost redevelopment. So we'll go ahead and start with a summary of what we learned here. First of all, every community has a very different and unique set of values and goals that they're trying to achieve. Some communities are trying to, for example, sort of rebuild maybe a blighted area of town. Other communities are potentially targeting a specific kind of job that they're looking for. Well, our community also has a unique goal. There aren't any other communities like Eugene and other states who are trying to accommodate 20 years of commercial multifamily growth inside a boundary. So it'll be up to us to find a unique set of interventions that are going to work for us and achieve that. So another thing that successful communities do is really embrace public-private partnerships. And in general, what that does is really start to change the tone and the perception of what can be done in certain parts of the community. And speaking of potentials, unique strengths of every community are really important to build on. So the old adage, location, 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 is very important. We'll mention some examples a little bit later on. They're also seeking multiple benefits is key. Rather than just getting a job or a unit, the more different benefits that you can hit through an incentive, the more successful it will be. For example, you can look at affordable housing, livability, culture, public safety, and jobs, and housing at the same time with certain interventions. We'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. In addition, it's important to think long-term with interventions, and there are really three main reasons for that. First is that interventions need to be in place long enough for the development community to come to depend on them. If it's uncertain that it's going to be around, it's very difficult to plan for that. Also, it takes time for certain interventions to take effect. If there's a market shift or increase in pricing that's done, that doesn't happen overnight. Finally, it takes time for the return on the investment, and most interventions are a public investment, to start to pay back into the community and sort of have lasting dividends. So concentrating interventions, given finite resources, is also very important. Connecting them to plans, for example, like what we're talking about with area planning, and also pooling resources with partners. I think LCC is a great example. You have communities partnered with school districts, with other government entities. So we're talking about public partnerships here at the last one. So how do interventions work? We can really break them down into three basic categories. The first one is freeing up land, and we're not talking about submission here. We're talking about redesignation or flexibility to allow, for example, commercial development in a place where it wasn't allowed previously. Second is reducing cost and risk to develop, closing that gap. And the third is to add value to an area, which closes the gap through increased potential rent increasing. So the first item, we'll just go ahead and walk through each one of these. The first item, freeing up land, is really the one that we're able to quantify at this time to some extent. And we'll skip to that right now. I'll show you what that looks like. First of all, flexibility and opening up industrial areas for commercial use where it makes sense has been talked about a lot. We mentioned this previously. We've done some analysis on this, and if you'll recall, we have a surplus of industrial land, especially on small lots. And that creates opportunities to balance land uses across the city. There are two areas in particular where there's some potential for this. The first is campus industrial. That's the I-1 designation. And this image here is up by Chad Drive. There are really two locations here and out by Green Hill. And there are just under 150 acres of vacant campus industrial land. And Obviously, we would need to do more study on this and have more community discussion about exactly how and where this goes. But as a preliminary position, if we said that half of those acres were potentially viable for commercial use, we might see a little over 4,000 jobs in capacity. Similarly, in West Eugene, and this has been discussed quite a bit, not only through the West Eugene Collaborative, but also through the Community Research Group more recently. So in looking out at these areas, just as again as a preliminary estimate, maybe somewhere around 110 potential acres here could have some capacity for commercial use. Again, if, just for the sake of discussion, we were to find about half of those 110 were available for commercial use, in Mason, we might see a capacity of about 2,200 jobs there. So adding these up, just pulling that remaining need from the diagram before and subtracting the capacity for opening up uses on industrial lands, we take a pretty big bite out of that gap. So I just want to do one more note of summary here. Again, our gap for multifamily housing, and this would be our final gap for commercial employment. Again, given the assumptions that we've been talking about here, with a 1.3% growth rate and 55-45 mix. This is what we'd be shooting for. So as we continue with the interventions discussion, some combination of the tools that we're about to talk about next is what we would need to consider in order to meet that need inside the urban boundary. So first of all, talking about interventions that reduce cost and risk, regulations can be a barrier to redevelopment. And simple, predictable, and flexible codes help a tremendous amount. And we've heard this a lot. Blair Boulevard in sort of the Whitaker area is a great example of one of our most flexible codes, and you can see if you've been down there, this is Ninkasi and St. Bon's, there's a lot of businesses that have a real synergy and are starting to really thrive down in that area, partly because of the flexibility available through the code. The new form-based code in Walnut Station is another great example of something new that we're trying out to open up a little bit of flexibility. So we're testing that. There's more that can be done and should be done, and obviously this is something that needs to be balanced with good design standards for their needs. Land assembly. So buying land in single parcels or in a big chunk, assembling land and getting a large enough piece of land to make economic sense for a redevelopment project can be very challenging. And that's often what communities will do. Either sell that, buy the land and sell it at a reduced cost, or donate that as part of a partnership. And that was the case here with Westtown on 8th. Again, this is a great example of a project that had multiple objectives. So in this case, it was bringing residents downtown. It was redeveloping property, of course. It's affordable. And it also stimulates small enterprises through the live-work units that are there. So grants are something that are not used a whole lot in this community, to some extent, but even small amounts can make a difference. This is an example of a small restaurant in the Blair area that got a grant from Wells Fargo that was facilitated by the city to do an outdoor seating area that really connects that business to the vitality on the street and helps create kind of a buzz in that part of town. So moving to interventions that add value to an area, really the main thing that communities can do here is capital improvements. And this can be a major civic investment like the Eugene Downtown Library. It can also be street improvements, parks, plazas, or any other kind of infrastructure that helps make an area more attractive or reduce costs for development. So many interventions actually reduce cost and add value at the same time. Business loans are a great example. In terms of reducing cost, a loan can help close the financial gap to make a project happen. The Bennett Building is a good example. Sweet Life, the image on the right, is an example how a loan can help a business get off the ground or renovate a space to make a go of it and really add vitality to an area that carries forward into other kinds of businesses and developments. Public-private partnerships, as we mentioned earlier, is often used. Broadway Place is a good example. The city's contribution, among other things, was a parking garage in that, and we'll mention more on that in just a second. Also, the Broadway Commerce Center, also known as the Bean Building on the right. Both projects also required financing, tax exemptions, federal grants to close the gap and make those happen. Also, in terms of reducing costs and adding value, time-limited tax exemptions in this community, we think about MUPT typically. It's what we've used in the past, multiple unit property tax exemption. They're effective and widely used across the country to get specific kinds of projects going, in this case, multifamily housing in targeted areas. So both of the projects shown here, High Street Terrace and the Tate, in addition to eventually over time generating significantly more tax revenue, they also bring residents and shoppers into the downtown area. They stimulate business growth, contribute to positive culture. So there's quite a few benefits that are seen there. Tax increment financing also reduces cost and adds value. It's locally known as urban renewal. And really what this is a source of funding for the other interventions. So this is really kind of what frees up the resources to be able to do a lot of the things that we just mentioned. So we have two districts in Eugene, the downtown and the riverfront. It's very flexible and gives communities leverage and resources to do some larger projects, including some of the examples that we've shown. So it's also used in other communities to fund things like schools and parks and brownfield remediation as well. So finally, combinations are very powerful. The image there in the center is the LCC campus going up right next to the Eugene Library. Of course, that's no accident. The presence of the library really makes that location interesting for them. In addition to the LTD station with MX and the ability, easy access to transportation. And the student housing component of that project would not be possible without access to the parking garage over under Broadway Place. So there's a real synergy between these different investments that have been made over time. So it's just a great example of how things pay back in the future. So I know there's a lot of information we covered. It's a little bit like drinking from the fire hose here, but we'll give you a take-home message. And that is that baseline redevelopment is expected to be insufficient to meet the needs for multifamily housing and commercial jobs inside the urban growth boundary. So what that means is some strong measures and commitment are going to be needed to be able to do that. And the best way to think about those measures is really from a long-term community investment standpoint. So that's a wrap, except for next steps. We're going to refine the assumptions and continue to narrow some of the ranges that we've been talking about. And finishing up the redevelopment conversation in preparation for the city manager's draft recommendation in March, following which, of course, we have a series of community forums in March and April, and then in May, council will convene to discuss the draft recommendation again. That's it.
Thank you. We're going to get to hear from Rick and Sue before.
Yes, I think at this point it'd be great to turn it over and see if you guys have something to add.
Well, I think, let's see, one of the main things I'd like to say is that key thing that Robin said a minute ago, which is that the numbers still need to be refined. And particularly, I want to point out that the redevelopment number regarding commercial employment, which is at 0, that has not been fully agreed to in the TRG subgroup yet. I mean, we've talked about redevelopment until we are blue in the face, and I think we're getting a better and better handle on what kind of redevelopment actually happens and why it happens, but we haven't had the final discussion to decide whether we think it's 0 or not. So that is something that we still have to do, and I hope it happens fast. We're trying really hard to work with the time frame that's imposed on us, and we're just not done then with that particular thing. The other thing is that as hard as we're trying to get down to a level where there's never any question about whatever recommendation we make, ultimately, down there at the bottom, somebody has to draw a conclusion from it and make a recommendation, and that won't be our job, that'll be your job. But we're trying to get as far down into that with facts and, fully defendable statements so that you'll have as little question as possible. But boy, it's kind of hard. Your turn.
Yeah, I think first I'd like to thank staff for all the work that they've done. As part of the TRG, one of the things we have the luxury of is being able to task staff with a bunch of work. Then we go away and come back, and hopefully they've done a lot of the work and have a lot of that taken care of. We have spent a lot of time on the tool that really has examined redevelopment. I keep trying to get Robin to bring it along so you can see how many hundreds of pages of spreadsheets there are in this. The things that we were able to accomplish is really sort of tool this so that it really recognizes a lot of our code issues, parking, open space, and things like that. So we're trying to take into account as much as we can. I think, as Sue said, one of the things we're trying to do is get as far down as we can into the weeds on this, and we're certainly way down there. The challenge that you're going to have is, the one thing I'm sure of is whatever we predict, we're going to be wrong. And that's the one great thing about forecasting or predicting, is you tend to be more wrong than right. But I think we're doing the job that's really necessary. I think that the city is going to be able to look at these models and see them, and they're very transparent. They're going to be active, so if somebody wants to say what ifs, we're going to be able to have these models and do that. And the whole goal of this will, of course, be to take a look at Pillar 7 and see how we move into that, which is the monitoring of what we're going to actually accomplish as we move forward, so that we can continue to fine-tune these things. So I think we've done a great job to date. We've got a long way to go, and about 3 or 4 weeks to get it all done in.
I have one more comment, just to say that I think that at this point, because of all the work and time that's been spent on it, which, by the way, is an honor to be involved in, I don't think anybody sees an easy answer. I don't think there's anybody left in TRG who said, we just need to, blow the line out there and just grow. I don't think there's anybody saying that, and I don't think there's anybody saying it's going to be a piece of cake to do it all inside. So, to me, a lot of those sort of philosophical positions have become much less critical, and we're really just trying to solve the problem.
So, again, thank you both very much for being here. Thanks for all those hours and hours and hours and hours of work that you have been put into this.
And Kevin are here, too.
And Kevin out there, too. Yes.
Great work.
And staff, thank you. So I've got Pat and then Andrew.
This is truly fascinating work. It really is, and I'm interested in the reams of paperwork that you're talking about. Not poring over them specifically. But, it's kind of interesting to look around the room and our audience left. They start talking about the real stuff, and the audience leaves. What's up with that? This is the stuff that's going to affect the people of Eugene for a lot of years to come specifically, and it's stuff that we are making decisions on. A couple of things that stood out really in your presentation. Just one thing I thought was interesting, the way you put it, Robin, was time-limited tax exemptions are effective and widely used across the country. I'd like to hear more about that, not right now, but at some time. I think clearly that is one of our major tools that we have used in the past, and one that I'm going to be in favor of using in the appropriate venues and the appropriate places for the future. I do have a question regarding the gap that we're talking about. Taking a pretty big bite out of the gap is encouraging that we have 110 or so acres available on around the Green Hill side in West Eugene. 110 acres that'll take a pretty big bite out of the gap is the statement they use. I have a question regarding those acres. And I wonder if the TRG has really focused on this, and maybe you can enlighten me just a little bit. Transportation facilities. It keeps coming up. Transportation facilities. We have these 110 acres that are out there that can potentially take a pretty big bite out of the gap of jobs that are missing from this community. Do we have the transportation facilities? Now, I know that's a rhetorical question, isn't it? We don't. But have you talked about that? How do we address the fact that we've got all this acreage that we can't get roads to? We don't have roads that supply it. We cannot develop it because we don't have the road.
That is a good question. It's certainly one we've been discussing. Came up at Planning Commission on Monday as well. It's a good thing that the timing of Envision Eugene is working well with the update of our transportation system update. And if we do assume additional capacity for jobs out on West 11th, our transportation system plan will need to show that we have the capacity out there to support that. Otherwise, we won't be able to count on those West 11th jobs. So it's something that we need to work in tandem with that effort. And luckily, the timing is lining up quite well with that.
A very well-stated answer to a very rhetorical question. And for the red light, Mayor, time to switch it on. You know, we've made decisions to eliminate transportation facilities, and it's something we need to look at for the future, is make sure that if we are going to count these lands in our inventory, you know, if we are going to count the jobs that these lands provide us in this community, if we are going to improve our economy by putting people to work in Eugene, we have to really think about our transportation facilities, and we really have to think about decisions that we make that really affect what we're doing to the economy in Eugene and Lane County. And thank you for the answer. That covered it very well. Thank you.
Before we go on, just to be rhetorical too, I could also say that our study for transportation out there has been part of the work that we've done. What's being worked on up past our area on 126 is part of the discussion as well about how that flow works. What kind of transit we use is also a discussion of how that flow works. So there's a lot of pieces to this that all go together. And I've talked about it several times, but I don't know whether Council has really seen what the Oregon Department of Transportation is doing to make more flexibility around your transportation planning and the what triggers you having to build more road and what doesn't trigger that and what options you have. But it might be really helpful for them to fully understand that the state is taking a fresh look at this and trying to approach it in a very different way than we did 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So if you could share that, that would be great.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to do
Somebody
that at
is.
this time, but we could certainly get back to you about that with an
That would be
update.
good. Andrea?
No.
Thank you, Mayor. To weigh in on the rhetorical question, I wonder how many of those jobs are going to be people who we employ from outside our area that are living actually on the west side. We don't know how that's going to look. But my question is, you know, we talk about redevelopment of medical buildings, and you display two of the boutique medical buildings, the premier medical buildings that have happened with private dollars. But I want to hear if there's been a conversation or if the University District Hospital was brought into it, because they're really struggling to meet their certificate of need to redevelop that area. And, I mean, those jobs, I mean, we lost a ton of jobs to Springfield. And if we can redevelop that hospital, we can bring those jobs back and add to our own economic stimulation. So I would really hope that that is taken into consideration. And I guess that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Okay, Alan? Pass. George?
Thank you, Mayor. Let's go to page 4. And let's look at the header. It says commercial employment need at 1.3% job growth rate equals 22,000 jobs. This is for the commercial sector only?
Correct.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Is retail included that, or is that a separate?
Yes, that includes retail.
That includes retail. Okay. Well, you know, I'm having problems with the different numbers that we're being presented with completely different numbers at every meeting. The last meeting on industrial land needs, we were told that the upper range was assuming 1.6, something like that, growth rate. We would need 8,000 new industrial jobs. Let's add 8,000 to 22,000. Now we've got 30,000 new jobs, and we're not accounting for government jobs. That was 10%. So, but then we have the joint economic, the joint elected officials, economic development, all that work. We were talking about 20,000 new jobs total in all categories. So the numbers are not adding up right. And I mean, because if we're going to have 30,000, say 32,000 jobs, the population's expected to grow by 34,000 people. 20,000 jobs, that makes sense. That's about 2/3 of the new population will be working, whether it's mom and dad. I won't include the kids, but well, if they're teenagers or older. It's just, you see what I'm saying? It's like it's impossible to make sense of any of this because these projections don't make any sense. If we go back to the base projections that Portland State provided us, and I trust them, they're as good at guessers as any. It's all guesswork, I get that. But if you say we're going to go 32,000 or 34,000 total population in 20 years, 20,000 jobs, the JEO's estimate, I think that's probably pretty good. But we're being presented with stuff now the last two meetings that just doesn't make any sense if you go back to the baseline. You see the problem here? So there's a math problem here. So this is coloring, and here's the problem with it. I think these are inaccurate. I think they're wildly guesswork. And this is how we're going to be making our decisions on how many acres of industrial land we need, how many extra acres of commercial land, how many for jobs. I'm just talking about the job part. I'm not talking about residents, multifamily, single family. I don't see how we can possibly make a good decision when the numbers are, kind of all over the board. So what I meant to ask last time but never got around to is, let's just go here, commercial employment land need. You could plug in industrial employment land need. You could plug in government land need. At 1.3% job growth rate, I think something that would be really helpful for us, as the council, would be to have what's the current employment rate?
George, you want another round?
What are the current categories? Because yes, I'd like another round.
It won't be long because it's...
I think, though, he's making a really good point that we've been bringing information on separate things, and I think we can easily bring some information that ties all that together. And it is confusing because there's the ECLA numbers, there's the updated forecast numbers, there's the numbers from the Regional Economic Prosperity Plan, which are different than this. So I think it will be easy enough to kind of tie that together in a way that hopefully will make sense.
Yeah, because I think what George is saying is that we want to be sure we're sort of all operating off the same data to make our decisions, right? And that we're using that to make all of our work, to do all of our work. And there's nobody else in the queue, so if you want to continue that.
Yeah, let's just continue this just a little bit. I was looking at a tentative agenda, and we're going to be seeing the final presentation here that's coming up. And I just feel like I won't be able to make any kind of a sensible sense of it with figures like this kind of all over the place. We need a baseline. I extrapolated back from the industrial figures last time, and that would have shown a population growth of over 70,000 people, and it would have shown total job growth of over 40,000 people. And we kind of need to tie all this in together, because without accurate data, even though we all realize it's all guesswork, but you have to have a commonly agreed upon standard to move forward and base a decision on. If you don't have that, I don't know what to do with this. I look at it doesn't mean anything.
I was just going to clarify, on March 14th, we're not asking you to make any decisions. So the March 14th presentation will pull it all together, and then there'll be time to get input, have additional work sessions, and we'll have to kind of work through that until you're ready to take action on that.
Well, one thing I'd like to see as soon as possible is what the current employment figures are and what the current breakdowns are. Because then we have a baseline. Then we can go, aha, at 1.3% job growth, I assume that's per year, over a 20-year period. Well, then we know what X is. We know what the current employment is, so that we can project from these increases. It's just simple math. There's no, it's like algebra. It's no big deal. But we need to know what the baseline figures are before we can make sense of the new stuff.
Go ahead, George.
I just have two more.
Okay.
If we go to page 10, redesignation flex, I know this is just an aerial photograph, but I'm seeing commercial jobs in the West Eugene industrial area, estimated 2,200 jobs. And the photo shows all of these light industrial areas. Are these the areas, I know it's just a schematic, But somebody that has a shop out there is going to see this and then go, wow, they want to turn this into a mall? Where am I going to have my workshop? Where am I going to, what, they want me to move? I mean, it causes anxiety in people. I just, is this the area that's potentially redesignated, and what thought has been given to where all those people are going to go if it is redeveloped for commercial?
Yeah, the areas that are just kind of preliminarily being looked at, and again, like we mentioned earlier, this needs to be a much broader or in-depth kind of process to determine how and where that might actually work best, both from a market standpoint and also, you know, what makes sense to keep as industrial, what makes sense to change over to commercial. So it's just a very sort of 35,000-foot look at that. And some of those areas that were talked about, excuse me, that we're looking at, were identified, for example, through the West Eugene Collaborative conversations within a couple of blocks, or I don't know, 3 or 4 blocks of West 11th. We looked at some other areas, potentially, you know, a little east of that have also been discussed in the past. So, and also at some point responding to interest from the community, where there has been over time people coming forward and saying, I have interest in doing X, Y kind of a use that I can't do now because of the zoning or the designation. What's the opportunity for that? And so there have been quite a few of those conversations going on. That just gives you some indication of areas that might be, from a market standpoint.
I understand that, yeah. But it just kind of, to me, it seems like, okay, well, we're hearing that there's a deficit of industrial land. So here's industrial land that's there. Now we're talking this overlay of like, well, let's get rid of this and put in commercial. So I seem to be kind of working at cross purposes. I just have one more thing. Real quick, just comment.
Or another round?
One more round.
Okay, because I've got Pat in the queue, and then I'll come back to you.
If this was the legislature, Madam Mayor, I may just submit my time. We don't do that here. Councilor Brown does bring us some good points, and Sarah, I appreciate the fact that you said that we're going to be able to tie all of those things together with more presentation. We don't have a lot of time to hear the details of everything that you all have been doing, and it's good to know that you're listening to what Councilor Brown has to say and able to bring all those answers back. But I'm certain you've had some level of discussion in the many, many hours that you put in on this. Excuse me. So thanks very much. A couple of things. You know, we're going through a lot of details here, and a couple of things. Robin, you speak kind of softly sometimes without placing some strong emphasis on some very important points that you make. You talk about rental rates have been pretty stable for some time, while construction rates have been going up significantly throughout that period of time, which makes it not particularly attractive to develop land, because it costs to redevelop land. It costs more to construct than people are willing to pay rent, because the rents are very stable. And you talked about intervention, and I'm really intrigued by that, by the means that we have for intervention that's going to promote the kind of development that's going to give us the kind of jobs that we need for the future. You talk about freeing up land, and you talk about reducing cost and risk and adding value to an area, and how they all weave together. So I want to emphasize that that's pretty important, that we do have intervention tools that we can use that will offset the fact that construction isn't particularly attractive to people right now because of the cost versus the return on the investment. So that's intriguing. I do have a question regarding the 1.3% number. You choose a number someplace in between the 0.9 and the 1.8. That's more or less have you been calling that like a safe harbor, or is that's a misterm for it?
It's not a safe harbor.
Yeah, it's not a safe harbor. If the two safe harbors would be the 0.9% and the 1.7%
okay, so this is
7% or whatever that is.
Okay.
Yes. But the communities do have the option of choosing another one that has to be justified, and it would not be a safe harbor.
Being in the middle doesn't justify? Just being in the middle doesn't justify?
I think it has to go into a little more.
But so while it's not a safe harbor, it's a safe median assumption, or middle of the road.
It's a good number to demonstrate what the potential need's going to be.
And as Councilor Brown says, it is all math, and if we have a number in the middle, it's easier to do the math one way or the other, based upon the number that we have to begin with. So thank you very much. Very great presentation.
Just a couple comments. Probably the obvious, but just wanted to say it anyway, that I think Councilor Brown has a lot of questions, and it'd be good to spend some time in between meetings to just flesh out some of those things, make sure we understand what is needed from any of us, but he certainly has brought up some things that he needs to make his decision. A couple comments that I would make is whatever part of town we're talking about and what we might see as potential there are all based on what the market allows to happen. They're only ideas about what is potential, but they are not and shouldn't be ever characterized as a thought that we're going to go in and make those things happen, because we can't make those things happen. They will happen as people see the potential and are willing to invest. So it is a combination of trying to put some tools in place that move things in the direction we'd like them to go, but ultimately it will be the business owners who will make the decision about the destinies of their own properties, not us. And just wanted to also remember that when we were talking about our industrial property, that although we have industrial property, overall these pieces are too small, and so when people come to look for industrial property, they can't find a place to put what they want to put because we don't have property of the right size. So that even though we have some unused industrial property, it has not matched with the needs out there. And the third thing I'd remind us of is, if you haven't, and I think you guys had it a few weeks ago, so I'm probably not when I wasn't here, but just remind us that the economic plan is, at least a good portion of, is embedded in our regional prosperity plan, and that's what we work on and are building on and trying to revisit and see how we're doing on how we've been setting out to do, not just ourselves, but with the county and with the university, with LCC, and with all of our other partners. And George, the other piece for me around the employment one, and it's just an interesting piece to me, because every time we get employment information, we get it for our metropolitan area. We don't get it for what do you call it when you take Eugene out of the, because its numbers are very different for Eugene than they are for the whole metro area or for the county. So getting that different piece of information tells you a different story, and that's an interesting piece. Although our economic destiny is with our metro area and our region, but the numbers are different based on which community you're from. So, and that takes you back to your wrap up. Do you have one more that you want to do?
I do. Yeah. Thank you, Mayor.
Sorry.
Just what you just said. Yeah. I mean, we need some clarification. If the joint elected officials, projection of 20,000 new jobs needed, I had thought that was just for Eugene. If that's projected to be Eugene and Springfield, that skews these figures even worse, because our share of that will be more like, say, 12,000 or 15,000 jobs over 20 years for Eugene, which makes all these other calculations totally meaningless from if that's the standard. So, yeah, I think we need some clarification about that, the EO figures. And
I think we can put together something that will add a lot of clarity here. In addition to looking at different geographic areas between the different sets of numbers, there's also different time frames, so that skews it too. But
Right.
we'll be able to lay all that out for you to make some sense.
I appreciate that. That'll help us a lot. Okay, well, I just have this is my comment finally. On page 7, under what we learned, it was mentioned that, rents and lease rates are flat, like that's bad for development. It may be bad for a developer, but for a retailer who's renting their space, that's okay. No, I'm serious. I can't emphasize this enough. It's like the square footage that you pay if you're renting, whether it's a restaurant or a grocery store or a bookshop or, a reused clothing store or any kind of retail environment. That's not bad, because that's like one of your biggest expenses is your lease. And it's not only good for the small business person, it's also good for the consumer, for the client, and for the customer that shops there. So I think we need to that should be back here and part of our thinking about economic redevelopment is like, it's not just what's good for the builder and for the developer. Of course, we want them to prosper also, but I will tell you, that's one thing that is a big concern of a lot of small people is rising rents and rents getting ridiculous. And I mean, I won't name names, but I could, of places around town who we've seen some old-time people move out and have to go to another place. You know, so there's nothing wrong with incubator places. There's nothing wrong with, from the retailer's standpoint, of rent staying stable over a long period of time. And just wanted to say that because I think we're losing sight of that in all these big picture looks and discussion. And I will just tell you that's really important for thousands and thousands of small business people.
Thank you. Andrea?
Well, this really it kind of hooks onto what we're talking about, but this is a totally different subject. And I didn't really think about it until I got here today. There was an article in the paper today about Springfield City Council waiving SDCs for businesses that are over 75,000 square feet. Is that what it was? So, Sarah, you know, in thinking of what we want for our community, I'm hoping that this can be a part of our workshop this weekend. And if not, then I'll be glad to make a motion next time we're together to direct the staff to tell us how does that look? You know, what would happen if we did something similar for a bigger business? And not that smaller businesses don't have the right to help too, but I really believe that we need to be a little bit aggressive with, if we want a business in our community, I think we need to show it.
We anticipated you guys might want to talk about that. So Kurt and his staff are looking at what Springfield did, and we'll be prepared to talk about that.
Oh, on this weekend?
We can talk about SDCs in general and what that means, and you know, kind of our long-term standing commitment of partnering with development to build infrastructure. We can talk about it broadly. I think the SDC conversation and other code and permit and things that are perceived as barriers are all part of the interventions we can do. But on a short term, talking about what Springfield did and how that may or may not affect close-term decisions or something we'll be prepared to just talk about.
I feel like there's a sense of urgency about this, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't want it to be talked about in 2 months.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're talking about it actively right now, and so we anticipated it would come up today and this weekend.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? All right, so thank you very much.
See everybody Friday, 9 a.m.? Friday, 9 a.m.?
Friday.
9 a.m. here.
Right.
Yep,
All right.
I'm here.
All right, thanks, everybody.